Okay, everyone, thank you especially for the patience just then. Welcome to our code meeting. I'm very excited to have Cindy Verbeek here, who knows more about codes, actually helped develop codes, has written codes, has been working in codes for decades. So anyone who has any questions, please just shout them out right away in the middle. Don't need to wait to the end. Cindy will be happy to help us with those. So it's an interesting year for us in the code world. Virginia and DC are both changing codes in the middle of this year. They're both adopting versions of the 2012 code, and so it'll be interesting for us to talk about them. And everybody's made changes, so there's a lot going on. Cindy works at the Institute for Building Technology and Safety, IBTS, and they're a company that does private plan review and private inspections, and we use them extensively on our DC projects. I think you do some work in Virginia as well, right? Or other people in the company do? Yeah. Okay. So, but we've found them to be very, very helpful on our DC projects, where the inspections, the city-run inspections, are a little bit difficult to schedule, if nothing else. Here's what we're going to talk about today: an overview of what the codes are, and then some specifics on what's happening in the 2012 residential code, how the 3 jurisdictions have made changes, and then some stuff on the 2012 energy code, which should be some of the bigger changes. So you'll see throughout the show we have flags keying which area we're talking about to try to help it be a little bit less of a jumble. And each of the jurisdictions adopts the codes in a different way. So in Maryland, the counties adopt the codes, so they can make whatever changes they want. And Montgomery County made a lot of changes. And in fact, all the things I'm talking about today are Montgomery County changes because in Maryland. We don't really work anywhere else in Maryland. So apologies to anyone who does work somewhere else in Maryland. These changes may not apply to you. In Virginia, they have a statewide code, which is based on the 2012 IRC, but they make changes. And in the District of Columbia, it's the same thing. They changed both of the codes and adopted it on their own. And they made some interesting changes too. And one other thing to point out in remodeling, you may be able to use existing building codes or for certain parts of a project or for the whole project, which can allow you to, say, reuse a set of stairs that does not meet today's code or something like that, depending on your situation. So when you're working in an existing building, it's important to know that there are provisions where you can leave things that don't meet code as long as you're not making too many changes around them or changes to them. Another important thing to mention about codes, which I hadn't realized for a long time, is that there's a lot of regulations we have to follow that just aren't in the code at all. Health Department is one of the big ones. Site plans, erosion and sedimentation rules, stormwater management, setbacks, and when you need surveys and what surveys you need. None of that stuff's in the code. It's all run by different departments of the government. So that's the end of where we are in the codes, and now let's start talking about the changes to the International Residential Code. So 2012 compared to 2009, there weren't a tremendous number of big changes. So we'll just hit them though. And the big changes are what the counties and jurisdictions did. One of the first ones that's pretty important is that smoke detectors are now required when you pull a building permit. And they've now allowed wireless smoke detectors, which is nice. So, and there's a specific thing written in there that says that security system smoke alarms can be the smoke alarms required by the code, which in some jurisdictions for a long time they were giving us a lot of trouble about this. Is DC warmed up to that idea now? Yeah. So there were projects we were doing where we had two complete sets of smoke detectors, but now if you own your security system and it alarms locally, those are good enough.
Hardwired to battery?
So if you have, that depends on how much work you're doing. Basically, if you have access to run wires, you're supposed to hardwire them. But the wireless ones have the battery. That's good enough, supposedly.
Before you switch away from
Yeah.
when you're talking about the ceiling fans, it's the 3 feet from the edge of the tip of the ceiling blade fan. It's not
3 feet from the middle?
From the shroud.
Where you're still under it? Yeah.
Yeah, 3 feet from the edge of the blade. And not
guess that could be important.
Right, and in small bedrooms, if you want to put a ceiling fan, sometimes that's really, it's hard to find a place that's not near the register and it's far enough away from the fan.
If we ever do a project with a small bedroom, we'll have to remember that.
Yeah.
Carbon monoxide detectors are also required for any fuel burning appliances, if there are any fuel burning appliances or an attached garage. So again, if you pull a building permit. There's a bunch of changes in wind design, which for us out in the field shouldn't be all that relevant. But they did clarify some stuff and clean that section up. It's a little clearer. We're kind of in the not that windy part of the country. It's basically the coasts, some mountains, and everywhere else, and we're in everywhere else. But if we ever do stuff in other areas, that can play in. Here's another interesting one. There's a number of provisions in the 2012 code where if your building is sprinklered, you can get away with stuff, and if it doesn't have fire sprinklers, you're not supposed to do it. So this is supposed to incentivize states to adopt sprinklers as part of the code. So fire sprinklers, if you have that, then you can build your building 2 feet closer to the property line than otherwise. We build a lot of townhouses in DC that are on the property line. Those have to be rated walls once they get within 5 feet of the line. And here's another fire provision. No roof penetrations are allowed within 4 feet unless you have a parapet wall. So townhouses that use the fire-rated plywood and don't have a parapet wall sticking above the roof, you have to keep everything a few feet away. That could come into play with some of the stuff we do. This was code back in the 90s. All garage doors had to be self-closing, and they put that back in the code. I think I actually read that no one's sure how it got out of the code, like it was a typo or something. Anyway, it's back in. And here's an interesting one that's new for 2012. Mechanical ventilation is required. It says mechanical ventilation is required for any house that is tighter than X, but X is the minimum tightness requirement in the code. So you have to do mechanical ventilation in every house now. But it's not that complicated. It doesn't say how you do it. It can be inlet only, it can be exhaust only, it can be an HRV or an ERV. And it isn't even that much stuff. So if we take a quick look at this, I mean, a lot of the buildings that we do, are going to be, in this area, right? So we're looking at basically a bath fan on a timer or left always on. That's going to be enough ventilation to count for this provision. So it's not that difficult to achieve. And we've been putting those into a lot of buildings anyway, right? It's a good idea. You build a tight house, you should put in mechanical ventilation. So it's not that hard to do. Another important thing to think about, if you haven't done an air inlet, ventilation inlet is where you want to pull that ventilation air from. Next to your car on the driveway, not a good idea. They have to be 10 feet from any hazardous contaminant. So it's important to think that through. That can get to be a hassle on a row house. Sometimes there's only limited places you really want to poke through the shell of the building. So it can be a head scratcher. They reorganized all the safety glazing sections, and I think they're really nice, actually. It's very, very clear. It seems to me that it lines up more with the actual hazards that we face than some of the old restrictions. So on stairway areas, if the glazing is within 36 inches of the walking surface, that needs to be safety glazing. If it's above that, does not need to be. Pretty straightforward. And you can even use a guard, a guardrail that meets all the guardrail requirements is good enough. So it's pretty easy to meet, pretty easy to deal with. At the bottom of the stair, once you get past 60 inches, that's not considered a hazardous area. And only within 60 inches and lower than 36 do you need safety glazing. So it's really pretty straightforward. I thought that was a really nice change to the code. This is one of these who didn't do this already code provisions. You have to have a drain in your escape well, so you open the window, 3 feet of water doesn't pour in on you. So we've always been doing this anyway. Sometimes we run down to the building perimeter drain if we know that's good. But on this house, it was a renovation of a 40-year-old house, and we were pretty sure that wasn't any good, so we actually ran through the wall into the sub-slab drainage system on the interior. Make sure we took care of that. One of the things that's been going on in code is a persistent attempt to change the stair geometry to a less slope. So Maryland, last code change went through, they changed to 7 3/4 maximum riser and 10-inch minimum tread. And DC has now adopted that this time around. So it used to be 8 1/4 maximum riser and 9-inch minimum tread. Virginia stuck with that geometry, and they probably will forever, as far as I can tell there. They don't seem to like to make big changes. But Maryland and DC are both adopted that new one. That can be a hassle if you're working in an old house and you want to mess around with the staircase. Most old staircases do not fit that. So you got to be careful how much renovation you do to a staircase where the code official is going to make you want to change the whole geometry and mess up the whole house. I think you're finding that they're being pretty good about that, right?
And DC is pretty lenient as long as you leave something from the original stair, which could be the header. It could be a stringer. It could be anything from the original stair. You can go back in with what was originally there. And basements, you still see a lot of the real steep, scary, narrow stairs into the basements. And as long as you leave something from that stair, you can build it exactly the way it was.
I think DC specifically said that for basement stairs. Do whatever you want. But we have houses in Georgetown where the staircase is this wide, and you're like, what? How did people ever move in this house? You have to crane the bed in and stuff.
Well, some of the risers on those stairs too, gets
Yeah.
10.5-inch risers on
Yeah.
those, and they're 20 inches.
Very big.
Right.
I mean, quite have people aren't very big. They don't have a lot of headroom, which is another thing we found in Georgetown. It was a house, and it only had like 5 feet 10 inches of headroom on the main stair.
Huh.
The builder in that case was 6'9". So he was bent over almost in half to go down those stairs because but there was no requirement that they change them. And old Georgetown board wouldn't let them change it anyway. In that case, it was Georgetown house, and it was historic. Somebody famous had
Hit their head on that header.
hit their
Yeah.
head on
Okay.
the header or something. They stayed exactly where they were.
I think this is a pretty neat way of putting this. For when you have unusual shape winders and curved stairs and that sort of thing, you basically measure in 12 inches from the narrow side of the walking area, which usually does not include where your balusters are landing on, so you have to remember that. But you measure in 12 inches, and then that's where the minimum tread depth has to be hit. And all the treads have to be the same depth in any section of winder or section of curved stair. But you can have 2 different sections of winders on a staircase, and they can be different, and they can all be different from the straight sections. So it's really kind of admirably clear. This isn't how people built stairs traditionally, but it's pretty easy to figure out if you want to build one. So just measure in, and that's where your tread depth is. Window fall protection, we talked about this when Maryland adopted this. If your window has more than 6 foot of fall outside of it, and it's lower than 24 inches to the bottom of the opening, then you have to have fall protection so a kid can't go through it. And basically you just stick something on there that prevents the window from being open more than 4 inches. And all the window companies have come out with devices that you can get from them to make that happen. So we've done this on casement windows, we've done this on double hungs. It's pretty simple. You just have to remember to ask for it, maybe before the final. Okay, this is the big deal. Fire sprinklers are in the regular code. So if you just say we adopt the code, you get fire sprinklers required in any new single or 2-family home. Maryland, of course, did this, 15 years ago? I mean, it was a long time ago. And they have us use this complicated NFPA 13D design. In DC, they just adopted it this code cycle, but they are using the much simpler provisions that are in the code itself, and they're just much easier to figure out. In Maryland, if you add a 90 to one pipe because you have to go around something, you have to send it back to engineering, and you have to file a permit amendment. because that 190 adds friction or something, I think. I'm not even sure. Something. So it's a big deal, but in DC it's a lot easier. And Virginia just amended it out altogether. No sprinklers required in Virginia. If you do, you can use whatever type of sprinkler that you like. So I know we've actually done 2 houses with sprinklers in Virginia, which is kind of interesting. And the inspectors there really don't know what to do with it. I think we had some interesting discussions with the fire marshal for one of those. They wanted to come inspect it in 3.5 weeks, if I remember, because it was a house, so they didn't care. This is another one of those that wasn't required. Yeah, you were not required to wrap your foundation pipes in silt fabric, but now, according to code, you are. But of course, we've been doing this for a long, long time. I think this is a very old photo. You're also supposed to put 2 inches of stone under it and 6 inches above it, so it adds up to a fair amount of stone. You can't just sort of sprinkle it with gravel and bury it. Here's another one of these sprinkler provisions. Floors that are not 2x10 or bigger, any I-joist floors, any open web truss floors, you're supposed to put a gypsum or 3/4 inch plywood surface under the bottom of it to protect it in a fire, unless your house has sprinklers or that area has sprinklers. And it's, I think the one thing that, besides any basement that we weren't going to finish requiring this, if it's in Virginia, it doesn't have sprinklers, I'd hold the phone on that. That would be a big deal. But crawl spaces that have a furnace in them now require gypsum on the bottom of the floor. If it's I-joist or open web truss, that's kind of a big deal. Almost a big enough deal that you'd want to not have a furnace in that space. Virginia got rid of that section altogether. So they didn't like that, and the builders didn't like that. It's gone. It's actually in the book, and it's in the online section, but there's a special document of errors in the code on the Virginia website, and it's in there that it was deleted. So you don't have to worry about that. For deck connections, which often do fail and are kind of a big deal, they've gone into much more detail about where you have to put the lags. Basically, you can't put them right at the edges of the boards where they'll tear out. That's a short story. But there's an elaborate diagram in the code book. Adhered masonry veneer, otherwise known as cultured stone, otherwise known as lick and stick. There's a couple of interesting things in there in the code now. It has its own section. First of all, they added sections for all kinds of different wall coverings, exterior wall coverings, which is kind of good. All that stuff we just learned in the Hardy panel, Hardy plank discussion. A lot of those things are required by code. You have to use a weep screed, which is this horizontal piece of trim at the bottom here. Let's see if I can make this pen work. This piece here. And that's basically kind of like a through flashing in a brick or stone, where the water, any water that's gotten through there and is in the on the weather resistive barrier behind it, gets pushed out through the wall, and before the wall goes down into the foundation area. So what that means to me is any lick and stick stone application that we do is going to have a horizontal line all the way across it at grade level. So that's something we'll need to get clients used to. If they're thinking it's going to look like stone going down into the ground, it's really not. I have seen people do this where they put sort of parging below the weep screed, and it just kind of looks like you have a solid wall and then stone on top of it. That might be a good way to handle it aesthetically.
That also is stucco and ephes. Also, if you do it
Oh,
with
yeah.
stucco or ephes, it's all adhered masonry.
Yeah. Here's something that it's now code. You have to put flashing on all edges of a roof. Unless you live in Virginia, you don't have to. But if you work for BOWA, you do. So this really saves a lot of rot and water damage. I mean, I think it's a no-brainer. We've been telling roofers to do that for quite a while. Here's another upgrade on the roofing. Because a lot of the sidings and claddings require a 2-inch gap at the bottom, it's now in code to put in 4-inch tall step flashings. Kind of makes sense. They're also supposed to be 4 inches wide. This thing in the brackets, the length of your step flashing should be the exposure of the shingles plus 2 inches. That's not in code, but just a friendly reminder. The 7-inch long step flashings don't work when you have the 10-inch exposure Grand Manor shingles or whatever those things are called. So make sure you get the longer step flashings. They do sell them at the roof center and what have you. And then we need these kick-out flashings down here at the bottom, this thing. Those save untold dollars in damage. If you let water run to the bottom of the step flashing and run behind the cladding, it just destroys the wall. And I'm sure you guys have seen me show pictures of that 5 or 10 times. I don't need to go more into that, but that's a good idea to be in code. Here's another neat provision. We're trying to add more insulation to walls. So they've said, well, you don't actually need multiple ply headers. You can have a structural header that just has one piece in it, and then there's lots more room for insulation. So there's a whole chart in the code now on how to size single member headers. You do require a flat piece on the top and the bottom, and the flat piece on the top can be the top plate, so you can just push the header all the way up to the top plate and then have one flat piece on the bottom, kind of like that drawing, this one on the right. Or you can do it with 2 separate pieces like this one. So that's kind of cool. It does start to add up though. This is in the walls chapter. The walls chapter is over 200 pages long. It's almost the same size as the old code book itself. But it's all because they add all these different things that you can now do very easily if you have the time to look it up in the 200 pages. This is one we got busted on. There's a requirement that your dryer vent have a permanent label showing how long it is. And I think this is so if you buy the wrong dryer, you're going to look in the manual and see that you can only go 27 feet and your vent is 28 feet long and you have to get a different dryer. I guess that could happen. Anyway, there's a maximum dryer vent length of 35 equivalent feet. It says you have to use fasteners on the joints, which a lot of us think is a big head scratcher because it'll just collect lint. It says the fasteners have to be a less than 1/8 inch penetration. And a lot of us also don't know, I guess it would be pop rivets. Yeah, it'd have to be, I don't know. I mean, it used to be you just taped them up. But now you also have to make this label or tag.
Back to that picture.
Uh-huh.
You also need water hammer arresters in your wash box.
Oh, is that required? I'll be darned. In everywhere or just DC?
Certainly in DC, the code
Okay.
requires it. Even though most washing machines and ice makers,
Mm-hmm.
same thing with ice makers. Most
What
of
is
them
that?
have.
Water hammer arresters.
Yeah, most of them have.
Yeah.
The washers have usually electronic
Those are
solenoid
probably
that takes care of it.
on the bottom.
Yeah.
But this is a big one.
Ours are hidden where you can't replace them.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is a big one in DC because they have third-party oversight inspectors, and this is one thing they know to look for. So
The key
the key
safety
here
issue
is-
on the house,
Exactly.
whether it
Now,
has hammer arresters.
They
Okay.
do get stolen, so if you're working in DC.
Oh my gosh.
Install them at the aisle.
That's some good advice right there. That is good. All right, so that's it on the general code. Any questions on any of that stuff? Okay. All right, let's look at, besides the things that Virginia deleted, they did make some other changes. So there's a thing called a habitable attic in the code, which says that you can have an attic that doesn't count as a full story in your house. And Virginia limited the size of it more than the regular code did. So in Virginia, it has to be under 400 square feet, or or 2/3 the size of the level below. I guess the level below would have to be smaller than 600 square feet for that to come into play. So if you already have 3 stories above grade, you have to keep a very small habitable attic above it. In other jurisdictions, you can do bigger. Here's another one that just really knocked my socks off. If you have fire sprinklers in Virginia, you don't need egress windows. Not in the basement, not anywhere, which I hope we would never design to. I'll just say that right now. Like, I'm not counting on those sprinklers. I know they're great, but I'd rather have an escape route. Thank you very much. And another thing that Virginia did add is even if you don't have sprinklers, you can count removing sash and tilting sash, anything that you can do by hand to make the window opening bigger counts when you're sizing the window opening. And they even made the requirement for basement window openings less than the regular code. So they made it a lot easier to get an egress opening.
Just throwing a brick through count as something you can do by hand.
I don't know, probably, if you're a builder in Virginia, apparently. So here's a really interesting one. Apparently this has been SOP in Florida for a while, Cindy was saying. They want you to make an accessible route through many houses, and so it's an interesting set of rules. If you have the egress door, a living and entertainment area, and kitchen on the same level, then you're required to have an accessible route from the door to the living, entertainment area, and kitchen. And if you also have a bedroom and a bathroom on that level, you're required to make an accessible route to there. And I have a drawing that purports to explain this. Basically, all the doorways and hallways have minimum sizes connecting from the front door to all those other spaces. So we don't have to get into it too far. It's 36-inch hallways, a 34-inch clear opening in a cased opening, or a 34-inch nominal size door instead of 32 or smaller is what's required. So it's not that complicated, but it's kind of something that I hadn't seen before and is only in Virginia. So you can see in here, then there's some other provisions. If the door is at the end of the hall, there's not enough room for the casing, you don't have to use a 34-inch door. And there's some other sort of odd exceptions that you can go through if you want. But
this is something you might see coming into the body of the code for those of you who are going to stick around for the next 2 or 3 code cycles doing this, because AARP this is something that they're really pushing because they're really pushing aging in place. It's got less to do with handicapped, mobility impaired as much as it does the elderly. They don't want to move once they're in their place. So AARP is really pushing this kind of stuff. And if you're going to be around doing building and code enforcement and things like that, certainly in 20 years, this will be in the body of the code. If you're going to be around that long, this will be in the body of the code.
I don't think it's a bad idea at all. We've done a lot of work for clients, right, where one of them starts using a wheelchair, or they have a friend who uses a wheelchair, and we're in there tearing out a perfectly good door that could have been made bigger the first time around and would have been no issue. So it's not the worst idea by any means. All right, any questions on Virginia stuff? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I broke my ankle last year. We live in a townhouse, and I will tell you, I couldn't walk for 8 weeks. I was on one of those little knee cart scooter things. So around, I'd sleep on the couch, and there was a powder room and a kitchen and all this kind of stuff. A wider door to the powder room would have been a really good idea, and that's the reason. Mobility impaired even just for 8 weeks was long enough to be mobility impaired.
And if you talk to the consultants who do this who help people adapt their houses, a huge number of people end up in a situation like that, where maybe they're not spending years of their lives mobility impaired, but many, many, many of us will have issues where it would be really nice to be able to actually get around your house. Okay, so let's look at some of the changes DC made. At the beginning of every code, there's a big chart, your winter design temperature, frost depth, blah, blah, blah. A couple interesting things here. Our winter design temperature in DC is 17. That'll be more interesting a little bit later. Ice barrier underlayment on the roof is not required in DC, according to their code. And the frost depth is 30 inches in DC. We'll compare that to Maryland in a bit. So mechanical ventilation, as we discussed, is always required in any new building. DC also has a provision where you still have to have natural ventilation even when there's mechanical ventilation. So it's just something to remember. I can't imagine why we would build a house that doesn't have 4% of openable windows, but it is a requirement in DC, an extra requirement. Here's a kind of a big deal. Any low-slope roofing has to be highly reflective. It has to meet Energy Star cool roof requirements and a 64 solar reflectance index. There's a couple of exceptions. It only has to cover 3/4 of the area of the roof, And if you have small terraces, then you don't need to use reflective roofing on them. But I started looking up some of the roofing that we've been using, the TPOs. You know, we use a lot of Firestone. They have a white, a gray, and a beige. And the gray and the beige are pretty light, I think. But they're nowhere near light enough to meet these criteria. These are very high criteria. So Sika PVC, Johns Manville PVC, most of their white colors are not white enough to meet this requirement. And with Firestone, not even all of their whites meet it, and none of their other colors do. So if you're doing a low slope roof in DC, it's going to be white, unless you meet one of these exceptions. I think it would be anything. Yeah, anything with a permit.
Anything that was a permit after the effective date of the code cycle that we're in
Right.
now.
Yeah. So that's kind of a big deal. It doesn't say anything about whether you can put stuff on top of it, other than green roof. You can put a green roof on it, that counts. But do you know if you can put pavers on top of a white roof? Does that?
It's not commercial.
Okay. So maybe that's, if people don't want to look out at it, we can cover it with something you can walk on. Mm-hmm.
Now, there are some exceptions to that, too. If you happen to be in Georgetown, you're not going to be able to put a white roof on any roof in Georgetown because HPO won't allow it and the Georgetown board won't allow it. So
Good to know. Good to know. DC, very, very important dryer duct provision. You have to support every 4 feet in addition to the 1/8 inch non-existent screws. No 12-foot spacing on the dryer vents. And here's an interesting one. You're supposed to design ductwork to manual D, kind of not very well enforced in other jurisdictions, but completely obliterated in DC. They do have a particular plumbing change. A clean out is required at the property line, or if you have a wall on the property line, just inside the wall. So that's something to remember. Probably the plumbers will catch up on that. But
another one, I didn't see your chart. Backwater valves, if you've ever done,
yeah.
Especially basements. You've got a basement. What the code says, and the way DC amended it, if the elevation is lower than the manhole elevation upstream, then you have to put a backwater valve in, which anytime you've got a basement, you're probably going to be lower than the manhole. It doesn't matter where the invert is. It doesn't matter where the sewer line is. They're talking about the manhole elevation. And in some neighborhoods, I don't know that you guys ever built in Bloomingdale neighborhood around Rhode Island Avenue, First Street in there.
Soon enough.
It's been, that's really what pushed that into the code, is Bloomingdale has a real problem with.
So that's actually a valve in the sewer line that's supposed to prevent backups from coming into your house.
It's a flapper valve.
Right.
And it needs to have access.
Yeah.
This is not something that you can just put it in the sewer line or the building drain and forget about it. It has to be accessible for maintenance and replacement.
So that's probably a big deal on a basement renovation. Yeah.
Because of the combined stormwater sewer.
Well, and that's the problem in DC
Yeah.
is because they have combined sewer, and if it rains heavy, it backs
Yeah.
up, and you probably soon have it.
Here's another big deal for our clients who already think that the draconian laws on shower heads are cause for anarchy and rebellion. DC, you're going to go down to 2.0 gallons per minute on your shower instead of 2.5. And sinks and toilets also have to go down. There's a label called EPA WaterSense. It's kind of like an Energy Star for water using fixtures, and those 3 fixtures are supposed to meet the EPA WaterSense guidelines. And then kitchens, 2.2 gallons per minute. They must not have WaterSense for that. So I think that'll be a big deal, particularly the toilet thing. But it seems to me most of the toilet companies, most of their toilets are available in this, in the 1.28. It's kind of become a standard in western states where they don't have any water. So hopefully this won't be too hard for us to adapt, except for listening to the complaining. If we're working on any townhouses, we have to have an STC of 45 on the walls. I haven't really seen this come into play, but it's something to know about. All right, so let's talk about Maryland. Unless there were any questions on DC. Anyone have a question for Cindy?
The
Go ahead.
STC rating, even if you're in a townhouse, if you're not opening up that common wall, you don't have to insulate it for sound.
Okay.
Only if you open up the wall. Most of them are brick or block anyway.
Yeah.
So the sound transmission rating is, it's just like it would be a mass wall.
It does.
Yes, sir.
Probably have it anyway.
On that, for the doorways and all
That is for a floor that has a kitchen, a living space, and an egress door, whatever floor that is. Yeah, but that's only in Virginia. Okay, so on to Maryland. Remember, DC's winter design temperature 17. In Maryland, it's 13, but ice and water shield is required, and the frost depth is 24 instead of 30. So I'm beginning to feel there isn't a lot of science to how they decide these things. Yes, sir.
It's changing.
Okay.
Actually, this is about 2 more weeks.
Okay. Oh, the
July
2015?
1st is
I didn't even look at
2015,
that. That's
and
funny.
that's going to 30.
Okay. 30-inch frost depth. Well, good to know. 2 more weeks, we can dig 24 inches. Ice shield underlayment on your roof is a must-do, though. I mean, that's been part of our spec for a long, long time. So whichever jurisdiction you're in. As mentioned before, we're going to use the NFPA fire sprinkler design, and they're required in a remodel if 50% of your floor area is demolished. Yeah, which is a higher criteria than is this a remodel. So you're going to require sprinklers in a lot of projects. They have an elevator requirement in Montgomery County. Again, this is just Montgomery County, Maryland. 5/8" Type X drywall on all elevator shafts. They changed around some of the foundation waterproofing requirements. In the code, you're allowed to damp-proof some foundations. In Maryland, you're not. You have to use waterproofing. And there's a list of 8 different waterproofing systems that you can use in the regular code. In Maryland, crossed off 4 of them. You can only use the other 4. You can look that up.
Usually use?
No. Yeah. They basically they crossed off 6 mil plastic and I think building paper. I don't know who uses those, but you can't anymore. A couple quick things that Montgomery County adopted the NEC. I think we're still on 2008 this code cycle, but we're going to 2011 and for the next one. Arc fault breakers are required. And I guess DC just adopted this as well as part of their code upgrade.
It's actually the body of the code of the 2012,
Yeah,
the electrical
yeah.
provisions of the 2012 IRC even.
So we've had some issues with those, I know, right? They seem to trip a little easily, especially in a remodel where you have some somewhat sketchy wiring. Or what was the other thing we had? Microwaves, or there was something that was always tripping them. Anyway, vacuum cleaners. You got to put them in, and they're a little bit expensive.
Most inspectors will not require an existing house with the existing wiring. If it's new wiring, they'll require them. If it's old wiring, they're not going to make you, because vacuum cleaners particularly are going to trip in every time.
Just don't vacuum.
That's so
Montgomery County also crossed off a lot of the code deck details and put their own in. Should we ever build a foyer over 60 square feet? I don't know if that's possible, but that could happen. You have to put plugs in there, so you got to figure out a way to hide those. And all decks require a plug. And then there's this turned out to be not that big of a deal, I think, right? The tamper-resistant plugs. I don't think we've had many issues with those. Anyone run into that where it's hard to find them? We were all worried that the 150 colors wouldn't be available in tamper-resistant, but I think they were, right?
Just
Yeah.
a customer calls up and says they can't get the plug.
Right. That's true. I've been.
Yeah, client-resistant plug.
I just don't know I don't know who to call. Who do I call when I can't get the plug in? All right. Radon control systems are required in Montgomery County. I think all of us who've been building over there are aware of that. And they have the same sound transmission issues if we run into multifamily. All right, any questions on Maryland? Okay. Okay. So the 2012 Energy Code kind of seemed like a really big deal a few years ago. Maryland adopted it a while back, so we have a lot of lessons that we learned in Maryland. Overall, it hasn't been that challenging, I don't think. Maryland adopted the 2012 without any changes. Virginia and DC made a lot of changes. Maryland, if you build a new house, you have to meet a 3.0 air changes per hour with a blower door, which is pretty tight. It's a little bit hard to hit. Virginia and DC, it's 5.0, which really isn't very tight. Like my house built in 1953 would already met that before I upgraded it. DC added some stuff like any heated slab. They have this whole long way of saying it, but heated slabs require insulation. So let me just talk about, there's actually 4 different ways you can comply with the code, which is confusing because there's so many provisions, but about half of them you don't really have to do if you follow one of these other paths. The first path is what's called the prescriptive path. That's when you read what the insulation requirements are and you meet them in every part of the house, and then you're done. So we're doing that on a lot of projects, but you can also use trade-offs, which is a long familiar story. I know a lot of us have done this for many years. If you don't have room to fit enough insulation in the walls, you add more to the attic, or you upgrade your windows, and you just do some simple math using rest check, and you find out if you made it. There's another path you can take, energy analysis, which is a much more complicated version of that, and you can trade off even more things to get away with a problem area. And you can also build a building that uses almost no energy, like a passive house level insulation, and then you don't have to worry about meeting all these other criteria. And there's a bunch of mandatory things required on all of it. So let's hit these prescription insulation values really quickly. As I said, you follow these, you meet code. Not much change in the windows. 0.35 U value. Any double pane low E window will meet this, unless it has a metal frame, which we don't use anyway anymore, I hope. Got a little smile out of John. The solar heat gain coefficient is the new thing this year. That means these windows can only let in 4/10 of the sun's energy, and that can make for a pretty dark window if you're not careful about it. So there are windows that have special coatings that allow a lot of light through, but not a lot of the sun's energy. But you kind of have to seek them out. So I feel like that's kind of a big deal. And it's not hard to find windows that meet that criteria, but they can be dark if you're not careful. The insulation requirements, attics went up to R49. That's probably the biggest change. And walls is kind of a big deal too. If you don't have continuous insulation on the outside, it's R20, which you have to use a 2x6 or closed cell spray foam and a 2x4 to hit, right? So we ran into that, right, Scotty? We had a wall. We had to use closed cell spray foam in. You can do what's called 13+5, R13 in the cavity, and then R5 of continuous insulation on the inside or outside of the wall. And floors are R19. Virginia, they cut that all back down to where it originally was, R38, R15 in the walls, or 13 plus R1. I'm not even sure where to get an R1 insulation, but if you could, that was all you need in Virginia. And then below grade, it's the same as it was for the last code cycle. R13 between studs in the basement, or R10 continual. And then the slabs, R10 for 2 feet. Okay. A couple quick things we've learned. To hit R49 in an attic, it's 16.5 inches of fiberglass, which costs between $1 and $1.40 if you spray it. Open cell spray foam is way more expensive, and closed cell spray foam is even way more expensive than that. So it's much better if you can design a building that uses fiberglass or cellulose. There is this provision, if you can extend the insulation full depth over the top plate, you can go down 1 level to R38, and that can save a little bit of money. But it's not a whole lot of money, right? It's like 15 to 30 cents to go from R38 to R49. It's just not that much money a square foot. There's a provision if there's not enough space in your ceiling cavities, then you can go down to R30, but only up to 500 square feet. This again is on the prescriptive path. You're required to have an eave baffle, and if you can get the full R38, so in this roof there's not enough room for R38, and the eave baffle comes down right on the top plate. In this roof we used energy trusses, and there is room for the full depth of the insulation, and we made the baffles go directly up out of the outside of the exterior wall, so that's much better. If you have to do the R20 walls, this is closed cell spray foam, and the siding guys hit a refrigerant line, so that's why we got to get a close-in look there. But R20 in a 2x6 is no big deal. R20 in a 2x4 is pretty expensive. And here's an example of the R5 continuous insulation. It's just foam board applied to the outside of the wall. In this case, it has furring strips attached for the siding to make a sort of a rain screen type siding. And this building actually was a friend of mine built this. the blower door couldn't get any reading. This building was so tight, so they had to use a duct blaster. So that's kind of cool. Here's another way to do it with 1.5 inch of beadboard or rigid rock wool gets you R5. This is rigid rock wool, which is a lot less expensive and in certain regards less environmentally damaging than foam board, so that's kind of interesting. So we talked about the trade-offs. Res check is how you use it. The energy model, you got more things you can do. You can plug in an air tightness value and then tighten your house down to meet that value, and then you can use that to trade off against if you have an area that's a 2x4 wall, you don't want to put closed cell spray foam in. So there's different types of software besides ResCheck that will do that for you. So here's an example of a project Mark did where we're using a peel and stick house wrap, virtually airtight walls once you do that. So we could have gotten a pretty good rating on those walls. So here's the air tightness test. If you're not familiar with the concept of a blower door, it's a calibrated fan that is put in the doorway, and it sucks air through the building shell and measures how much air is leaking through the shell. So that's how you know if you pass or not. As we said, in Maryland, it's required 3.0 air changes per hour. In none of these jurisdictions is a blower door test required in a remodeled house, which makes sense because it's just impossible to figure out which parts you did and which parts you didn't. In Maryland, we had one county that was saying anything up to 3.99 counted as 3, but state made them stop doing that. DC is 5.0. In Virginia, you don't even have to do the blower door. You can do a visual inspection of your air sealing work, in theory. Yeah, which has been code for 10 years and has not resulted in very tight houses, but that's Virginia for you. Okay, so here's a couple of the mandatory provisions. We'll just go through these real quick. Any hydronic lines now require R3 insulation, which is kind of thicker than the regular stuff. Most of the stuff we get is like R2, so it's something to remember. Also, one thing that we've learned is plumbers usually don't think they're going to do that. So you got to hire someone else, which if you think about what plumbers charge, it probably makes sense to hire someone else. Hot water piping also now requires insulation in most of our larger houses. Most of the piping is going to require insulation. There are some exceptions, and there's more exceptions in Virginia, but a lot of it will still require it. Pools have a bunch of weird provisions, and the cover is required for heated pools, but I heard about a project where it was a heated pool and a piece of bubble wrap was delivered and was sitting on the edge of the pool for the final inspection, and then it mysteriously disappeared after that, and that somehow counted. So I don't think that provision is really that hard to hit for what it's worth. In Maryland, there's requirement that 75% of lights be high efficacy, or 75% of fixtures, which is kind of a weird. You can do one or the other, and low voltage lights don't count. So it turns out this isn't that hard to hit, right? You just buy a bunch of those fluorescent bulbs and screw them in. You're done. In Virginia, they cut it down to 50%.
Is that commercial and residential?
I have no idea. Is that commercial and residential?
Well, yes, because most commercial are using the LED lighting and all that kind of stuff, because there are commercial projects in DC are all subject to the Green Building Act, or almost all of them are, and the Green Inspector. So it's a requirement for commercial provision. So if you are doing commercial work,
a lot of the condos, at least in Montgomery County, those are considered commercial.
Oh, right.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Yeah,
Even
I don't
though
know.
they're reviewed still usually under the residential provisions of the IECC.
Usually the engineer would do a count for the whole thing to figure that out.
Huh.
Well,
Did they make you do that?
Commercials, so it's reviewed on a commercial.
Yeah.
Did they make you put in LED lighting?
Well,
We did anyway.
We did LED every single job.
Yeah, exactly. So it's funny how fast that went from, oh my God, to, oh, all right. Okay. Ductwork sealing is different in each area, kind of interesting. In Maryland, a very difficult to hit standard for 4 CFM leakage per 100 square feet of space. This is the Energy Star requirement. From what I've heard, there's a lot of HVAC contractors signing off on documents that turn out later to be completely false. Like if you do a lead for home, a third party comes in to test the ductwork, they find out it has no resemblance to what the HVAC guy said it did. So it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of cheating. In DC, they changed it to 8 CFM, which is much easier to hit. And they also have a specific provision that if you're in a remodeling situation, existing ducts and existing systems don't need to be tested, but a new complete system does. And then in Virginia, you can just inspect it visually. Looks tight, you're good. And if you do test it, it's a 6 leakage instead of 4. Yeah, those inspectors have a lot of work to do in Virginia. Spray foam is a good way to seal and insulate ducts if they're outside the envelope and you got hit R8. This is a reasonable way to do it. It's actually right in the code that you don't need additional sealing beside this, so you just run the ductwork and spray foam it. It is a little bit hard to set it all up so you can hit all sides of the ductwork in a reasonably proficient way in a lot of spaces. So sometimes it isn't as easy as you might have hoped, but it can be done. One thing, if you are doing duct testing, you really have to seal it to the drywall, which that happens because of the way the phases work, right? The HVAC people seal all the ductwork, then the drywalls run. Well, you still have to seal it after that. So something to remember. This is something that came up that was kind of confusing. In the energy code, it says you have to follow Manual S and Manual J to size your equipment. It turns out that there's kind of holes between equipment sizes where there's no legal air conditioner you can install. If there was one code official in one jurisdiction who started enforcing it to the letter, and it caused a lot of headaches for everybody. So Virginia rewrote the code, so now you don't have to do that. You can, and this actually, to me, I think this makes perfect sense. If you have a multi-speed unit, as long as the required load is somewhere in the range of delivery that multi-speed unit can do, you're fine. You can go up one size, or if you're using the smallest size in the manufacturer's line, good enough. So I think that all makes sense. It turns out that from what I've heard, this issue doesn't really cause a lot of excessive energy use, and usually not even any comfort issues. So another thing that Fairfax County was letting us do was put in a second system that they called a party system that they didn't count somehow. They wanted you to have the whole house all calculated out, but then you could just throw another air conditioner in. Okay. I guess that's an approach. Getting towards the end here. An interesting provision in the code calls for gasketed doors on wood-burning fireplaces. And wood-burning fireplaces come in 2 types, right? There's a kind that got tested in a third-party lab that costs a lot of money, and it has a fire rating, a UL rating, like a whole complete unit. And then there's a kind that gets built on site, and it's just a pile of rocks glued together with masonry. And it turns out that neither of those should really have gasketed doors unless it's one of these that was tested with gasketed doors. And the people who test fireplaces said you should never put gasketed doors on a masonry fireplace. And you should never add gaskets to a tested fireplace that wasn't tested with gaskets. So Virginia just deleted this provision, which I think makes sense. And I think if we ever ran into a situation where we were being asked to do that, there's some letters floating around from these testing agencies that say that it would severely impair safety, and the code officials are supposed to pay attention to letters that say, at the very beginning of the code, it says this code is not designed to reduce safety. So they should pay attention to that. Have you run into that?
Well, I mean, I personally would never enforce gasketed doors on a fireplace.
Montgomery County has for a few years now,
Uh-huh.
and it's a lead time issue as well.
Oh, because you have to get a special unit?
Custom ordered and built,
Oh.
so, which they won't measure it just like showering class until the opening's
Right.
done. So there's been issues with getting them in time and also getting the final inspection not happening, so.
Right.
I don't know if these letters are working in Montgomery County or.
I've had a couple discussions with them, and
I know a
it seems
lot
like
of
maybe
people
not.
put them
But-
in and then want them ripped out immediately.
Yeah.
It's another of those items.
Well, you shouldn't burn your fireplace with them shut, I will say that. But, I don't know. Yeah, it's an interesting one. And then one other difference, the base code says any attic hatches or doors will be weather stripped and insulated to a comparable level. But in Virginia, they kind of, this is kind of like, well, do what you were going to do. Vertical doors require only R5, again, 1 inch of blue board. And pull down stairs, 3/4 of the panel area has to have R5 insulation. So it's kind of like gluing styrofoam to the back of the panel is good enough. So that's probably more practical. All right. That's actually it. Any questions for anyone?